4 days. That is what stood, as of today, between the government of Canada and a 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion of its own exports. Not 25%, not 35%, 50%. Stacked on top of tariffs that are already in place, on top of a trade relationship that has been unraveling for 18 straight months. The clock reads August 19th, 2026, 12:00 a.m. Eastern Time, and that is the moment the United States is set to impose what are formally called Section 338 tariffs on 554 separate categories of Canadian goods. Hockey sticks, wine, cement. Products that, on paper, sound almost quaint next to the scale of the number attached to them. And in Windsor, Ontario, a city that has spent the better part of 2 years absorbing the sharpest edge of this trade war, factory floors have already gone quiet more than once because of dates just like this one. So here is the question actually worth asking, and it is not the simple one the headlines want you to answer. Did Canada walk away from President Donald Trump, or did Trump walk away from Canada first and is now finding out what that decision costs him? Because the honest answer, built entirely from verified reporting rather than assumption, is more complicated than either side's talking points suggest. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly where the leverage actually sits, and why nobody, not even the people in the room, is certain how this ends. Start with where things stood 18 months ago, because the roots of this moment go back further than most people realize. According to the Congressional Research Service, in February and March of 2025, early in his second term, President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports, citing what he called a national emergency tied to fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. Energy and potash were carved out at a lower 10%. Canada retaliated almost immediately. Canada's own government order, tracked by the law firm Blake's, shows Ottawa slapping a 25% retaliatory surtax on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods starting February 4th, 2025. With a second, much larger round targeting $125 billion in Canadian goods threatened weeks later. This was not a disagreement. This was, by any definition, a trade war, and it was moving fast. By March, Trump had layered on 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum from every country, Canada included, and a 25% tariff on automobiles under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, according to trade compliance firm Avalar's timeline of the dispute. There were pauses. There were exemptions for goods compliant with the existing free trade pact between the two countries, known as USMCA or CUSMA, depending which side of the border you're standing on. But the exemptions never fully resolved the underlying fight, and the effects showed up almost immediately in the one place they always show up first: paychecks. There's an earlier flashpoint in the same stretch of 2025 that rarely gets mentioned alongside the Reagan ad, but it matters, because it shows this pattern of abrupt termination started months before that World Series weekend. According to the Congressional Research Service's tracking of U.S. Canada trade relations, Canada had planned to begin collecting a new digital services tax on large technology companies starting in June 2025. President Trump responded by stating he would terminate trade talks with Canada entirely over the tax. Ottawa backed down within days, announcing it would not collect the tax and would move to rescind the legislation altogether. That is worth sitting with. Twice in 1 year, Canada made a significant policy reversal specifically to keep talks with Washington alive. First on a tax targeting American tech firms, then, months later, on a political advertisement most Canadians had never even seen before it made headlines. And ABC News' own timeline of the broader tariff rollout captured just how immediately financial markets reacted to the uncertainty each time a new round landed. When the initial 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico were announced alongside new duties on China, the S&P 500 dropped roughly 2% in a single session, and the Nasdaq fell 2.5%, even after the White House carved out a temporary pause for USMCA-compliant goods days later. Markets, in other words, were pricing in exactly the kind of unpredictability that has now defined this relationship for a year and a half. Here's the number that should stop you cold. According to the C.D. Howe Institute, a nonpartisan Canadian economic research organization, employment in Canada's motor vehicle and parts manufacturing sector fell nearly 6% between January 2025 and March 2026. Export Development Canada, the country's official export credit agency, put a sharper point on it. Manufacturing overall lost just over 32,000 jobs in that same 12-month window, with motor vehicle parts alone shedding more than 7,000 positions. And nowhere absorbed that shock harder than Windsor. Windsor sits directly across the river from Detroit, connected by the Ambassador Bridge, and for decades, that geography was an asset. An integrated auto corridor where parts and vehicles crossed the border multiple times before a single car was finished. Reuters reported that Windsor's unemployment rate climbed above 11% by June of 2026, the highest of any major Canadian city, as local businesses like the signage company Fast Signs watched orders from automotive clients dry up and customers demand longer payment terms just to survive the uncertainty. CBC News captured the human version of that statistic back in April 2025, when Stellantis paused production for 2 weeks at its Windsor assembly plant, the factory that builds the Pacifica minivan, directly citing the new U.S. auto tariffs. Workers described the layoff to CBC as frightening, with some receiving partial pay top-ups from the company and others, newer to the job, getting nothing at all. And it wasn't just workers sounding the alarm. Windsor's mayor Drew Dilkins told CBC News the city could see unemployment climb as high as 30% if the tariff situation worsened, calling a quick resolution between the two countries imperative. Ontario's own Financial Accountability Office modeled the damage in a report that CBC covered in detail. Windsor projected to be the hardest hit metropolitan area in the entire province, with employment there running 1.6% below where it would otherwise be in 2026. The office estimated the province as a whole could lose up to 119,000 jobs this year alone, climbing toward 138,000 by 2029 if the tariff scenario held. There's a flip side to Windsor's story worth including too, because a purely bleak picture wouldn't be accurate. Reuters reported that after Trump exempted USMCA-compliant Canadian exports from tariffs in March of last year, Windsor partly regained its footing. Automaker Stellantis added a third shift at its local plant earlier this year, and LG Energy Solution announced it is building a new battery facility in the region. Both developments, the Windsor-Essex Chamber of Commerce pointed to as genuine signs of confidence returning. But the same Reuters report quoted the Chamber's chief executive warning that so long as the broader trade relationship stays intact, Windsor will be fine. An if-then statement that captures exactly how fragile that recovery still is. And the Tax Foundation, a U.S. based nonpartisan research group, estimated the cumulative effect of the Trump administration's tariffs across all trading partners amounts to an average tax increase of roughly $900 per American household in 2026. A reminder that the cost of this standoff isn't confined to one side of the border either. Now, layer in the legal chaos, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange. In February 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump that the emergency powers law Trump had been using to justify many of these tariffs did not actually give the president that authority. Wikipedia's detailed timeline of the trade war, cross-referenced with the Congressional Research Service's own tracking, confirms the administration responded by withdrawing the IEEPA-based tariff actions and instead imposing a new, temporary 10% import surcharge under a different legal authority. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a law that only allows tariffs to stand for 150 days at a time. In other words, the legal foundation under this entire trade war has already been kicked out from under the administration once and rebuilt on a temporary structure that has to be renewed or replaced before it expires. But if the legal fight was chaotic, what happened next was almost theatrical. On October 23, 2025, the Canadian province of Ontario, not the federal government, the province, began airing a television advertisement in the United States, featuring a minute of audio from Ronald Reagan's 1987 radio address on trade, in which the former president warned that high tariffs, in his words, inevitably lead to retaliation and trade wars. The ad ran during Game 1 of the World Series between the Toronto Blue Jays and the Los Angeles Dodgers, broadcast on Fox, watched according to NBC News by more than 9 million people. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute objected almost immediately, saying on social media that the ad used selective audio and misrepresented the full address. And that same night, President Trump posted on Truth Social that he was ending all trade talks with Canada immediately. His exact words, as reported by ABC News and multiple other outlets, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. Think about that sequence for a second, because it matters for everything that follows. It was not Canada that first blew up the negotiating table in this chapter of the story. It was the President of the United States, over a 30-second clip of a dead Republican president's own words being used against a tariff policy. Ontario Premier Doug Ford pulled the ad within a day, telling reporters Ontario would pause its American advertising campaign so that talks could resume. Though CBC noted he let it run through the World Series weekend first, a small act of defiance folded into an otherwise fast retreat. Trump later told reporters aboard Air Force One, according to CBC, that Prime Minister Mark Carney had personally apologized for the ad. Carney confirmed it, saying publicly it was, in his words, not something I would have done. And yet, even after the apology, Trump told reporters on October 31st that the two countries would not be restarting trade talks. a cold response to what was, by any account, a full climb down from the Canadian side. So if you're keeping score on who has actually walked away from this relationship first, over the 18 months this dispute has run, the record so far leans toward Washington, not Ottawa. Here's where the story pivots, though, because Canada did not simply sit and wait for Trump to change his mind. While trade talks with the United States were frozen, Prime Minister Mark Carney went to Beijing. On January 16, 2026, according to a release from the Canadian Prime Minister's own office, Carney met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first meeting of its kind in the Chinese capital between the two countries' leaders in 8 years, and the two sides announced what Carney called a landmark new strategic partnership. The details, confirmed by Canada's federal government website, are substantial. China agreed to cut tariffs on Canadian canola seed from roughly 85% down to around 15% by March 2026, a shift affecting a market worth about $4 billion a year to Canadian farmers. Canada, in exchange, agreed to let in 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles annually at a reduced 6.1% tariff, down from the 100% rate it had imposed in solidarity with the U.S. the year before. By March, Canada's government confirmed China had also reopened its market to Canadian beef, pork and cattle genetics, and pet food, categories that had been effectively shut for years. It did not take long for Washington to notice. Reuters reported that within days of the Beijing trip, Trump threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian exports if Ottawa moved forward with a full free trade agreement with China. Carney's response, delivered publicly and covered by Gulf News, was carefully worded. Canada, he said, had no plans to pursue a complete free trade deal with Beijing, framing what had just been signed as a narrower set of sector agreements, rather than a rupture of its obligations under the existing North American Trade Pact. It was a tightrope walk. Diversify away from overwhelming dependence on the American market, without triggering the kind of retaliation that could make the American relationship even worse. Reuters, in a separate piece on Carney's broader strategy, described him as trying to position Canada as a leader of a new global trading order less reliant on the United States, working with what he called middle powers, as Trump's foreign policy grew more unpredictable. That word, dependence, is the one that explains almost everything else in this story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The United States is not just Canada's largest trading partner. It is, for huge parts of the Canadian economy, functionally the only market that matters at scale. And that asymmetry is exactly why, even as Carney was shaking hands with Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People, his government kept the door to Washington propped open. In between the Reagan ad freeze and this summer's escalation, there was actually a moment that looked like a thaw, and it's worth including precisely because it shows how quickly this relationship can swing in either direction. According to a report carried by Barchart, Trump told reporters outside a Kennedy Center gala in early December that he wasn't sure whether he'd restart the talks he had halted, answering simply, "We'll see," when asked directly. But in that same conversation, he described having a good relationship with Carney and said Canada makes, in his words, a lot of things the U.S. doesn't need because it already makes them itself. A strikingly similar sentiment to what he'd repeat more forcefully to Fox News 7 months later. Reuters separately reported that Trump, Carney, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum met privately for roughly 45 minutes on the sidelines of the 2026 World Cup draw at the Kennedy Center that same week, with no staff present, discussing trade and immigration. Trump called it very productive at the time. That meeting happened as all three countries were preparing for the mandatory 2026 review of their trade agreement, a review the Congressional Research Service describes as the first of its kind for any American free trade deal, a built-in checkpoint that gives any of the three governments a formal opportunity to reshape or unwind the pact rather than simply renew it by default. Which brings the story back to this summer and to the collapse-then-recovery pattern that defines where things stand today. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed the order that created the Section 338 tariffs, now scheduled to take effect this week. An additional 50% duty layered on top of existing levies, covering approximately $20 billion in Canadian goods across 554 separate tariff lines, according to reporting from Tech Times that cross-references the signed order directly. 8 days later, on July the 28th, Trump told Fox News channel's Fox and Friends, in a phone interview, that he had essentially lost interest in preserving the broader North American trade agreement at all. Asked directly whether he cared about updating it, his answer, quoted directly by Tech Times from that broadcast, "I don't care." He went further, arguing that Canada and Mexico needed the United States far more than the reverse, telling the program, in his words, "Mexico and Canada need us. We don't need them." That is not a negotiating position designed to build trust, and Canadian officials noticed. On August 6th, according to the Washington Post, Prime Minister Carney described the state of trade negotiations with a single word: nasty. That characterization came, the Post reported, after Trump criticized Canada's leadership directly, while simultaneously threatening to expand the tariff list even further. Bloomberg's coverage from August 13th captured the tightrope Carney has been walking domestically ever since he took office, quoting a pledge he has repeated many times over the past year. Canada, he has said, will not accept a bad deal. It is a line meant to reassure Canadians that their government won't simply fold under pressure, but it is also a line that keeps the possibility of no deal at all firmly on the table. And then came the moment that gives this script its title. On August 12, 2026, CBC News reported, citing two sources with direct knowledge of the negotiations, that Canada and the United States were not yet at a point where a deal could realistically be reached, and that Canadian officials were unsatisfied with the latest American offer on the table. That same day, CTV News reported that Canada's lead trade negotiator, Janice Charette, had explicitly warned her American counterparts that if the White House followed through on the 50% tariffs scheduled for August 19th, it could put the entire remaining negotiation at risk. Not a certainty, a warning, the kind of warning a negotiator makes precisely because they want to avoid having to follow through on it. CBC also reported something worth pausing on, because it complicates the picture of who is aggrieved here. When announcing the upcoming tariffs, the United States raised a list of specific trade irritants it wanted addressed. Among them, Canada's decision to pull American alcohol off provincial store shelves as an earlier act of retaliation, and allegations that Canada discriminates against American-made vehicles and dairy products in its own market rules. In other words, this is not a one-directional grievance. Both governments are walking into this deadline with a list of complaints about the other, and both have already taken retaliatory steps of their own well before this week's headlines. So did Canada actually walk away? As of the most current reporting available, the answer is no. And in fact, the trajectory has bent in the opposite direction just in the last few days. The Washington Post, in reporting published this morning, August 15th, said the United States and Canada are, in its words, inching closer to a deal that would avert the punitive 50% tariffs, citing industry executives and trade specialists who are following the talks closely and naming products like hockey sticks, wine, and cement as examples of goods that would be affected if no agreement is reached in time. That is a meaningfully different story than one where Canada has simply left the table. It suggests a negotiation still very much alive, still moving, with both sides working against a deadline that neither one appears to actually want to trigger. Which raises the real question underneath the title of this video. If Canada hasn't walked away, and the two sides are reportedly closer to a deal than they were a week ago, where does the idea of Trump's biggest trade mistake actually come from? The answer isn't a single decision. It's the cumulative pattern. 18 months of imposing tariffs, retreating from them under legal pressure, imposing new ones under a different legal theory, freezing negotiations entirely over a 30-second advertisement, and then declaring, on national television, that he doesn't particularly care whether the broader agreement survives at all. Every one of those moments has a cost, and that cost has landed disproportionately on one Canadian city more than almost anywhere else. Go back to Windsor one more time, because the numbers there tell you what unpredictability actually does to a real economy, as opposed to a headline. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association's president, Brian Kingston, told CBC News back in July 2025, before most of this year's escalation had even happened, that continued tariff threats could tip all of North America into recession, and that cities like Windsor would be the first to feel it because, as Windsor-Essex Chamber of Commerce Chief Executive Ryan Donnelly put it to Reuters, when the U.S. threatens, Windsor feels it first and feels it hardest. That was true in April 2025, when Stellantis idled its Windsor assembly plant. It was true again through 2026, as Export Development Canada tracked motor vehicle and parts GDP falling 7.6% year over year, alongside steep declines in wood products, paper, and metals, all industries with deep roots in the same trade-exposed regions of Ontario. And it could be true again on August 19th if this week's optimism about a deal doesn't hold. The national job numbers back up what Windsor has been living through block by block. Statistics Canada data, reported by Al Jazeera, showed the Canadian economy shed 40,800 jobs in July 2025 alone, pushing the national employment rate to an 8-month low. Months later, in January 2026, the country lost another 25,000 jobs overall, with manufacturing accounting for the bulk of it. 28,000 positions gone in that single month, according to figures reported by the outlet Meta Intro and confirmed against Statistics Canada's labor force survey. Bradley Saunders, a North America economist at Capital Economics, called it the largest monthly decline in the Canadian labor force in 5 years. And Export Development Canada's more recent tracking shows the pressure hasn't let up since. In April 2026, the United States rolled out a new tiered system of Section 232 tariffs covering steel, aluminum, and select copper products, adding yet another layer of cost to metal-intensive manufacturing at the exact moment Canadian exporters were still trying to adjust to everything that came before it. There's a longer-term number attached to all of this that deserves attention too, because it extends well past this week's deadline. A study from the Future of Canadian Automotive Labour Force Initiative, modeling the combined effect of ongoing trade disruption and the broader shift toward electric vehicles, found that under the worst-case scenario, the sector could lose as many as 195,000 jobs by 2040. And critically, the report found that outcome depends far more on whether Canada retains preferential access to the American market than on the pace of the EV transition itself. That is the long shadow this week's negotiation is actually being fought under. It is not just about hockey sticks and wine and cement. It is about whether the integrated cross-border manufacturing model that built cities like Windsor over the past century still has a future at all. It's also worth putting a finer point on exactly what China gained from Canada's pivot, because the numbers involved are large enough to explain why Washington reacted the way it did. Canada's own government release states that since Carney's Beijing visit, China resumed beef market access for 20 separate registered Canadian meat facilities as of mid-January 2026, reopening a market that had been worth close to $200 million a year before it was suspended. China also restored access for Canadian pig and cattle genetics and signed a new pet food safety protocol, with Canadian officials describing further expansions to processed and canned pet food as still to come. Analysts at The Hub, a Canadian policy outlet, framed the broader agreement as especially significant for Western Canada, noting that premiers from British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, provinces that don't often agree politically, were unusually aligned in welcoming a deal that opened new demand for oil, lumber, and agricultural exports beyond the American market. Saskatchewan's premier, who traveled with Carney to Beijing, called it a great day for Canadians. None of this makes Canada's economy less dependent on the United States in the near term. Reuters was blunt about that constraint in its own analysis, noting Carney's ambitions to lead a new global trading order still run up against what it called Canada's overwhelming economic dependency on its southern neighbor. But it does explain why Ottawa had somewhere else to turn when talks with Washington went cold, and why Trump's threat of a full 100% tariff in response was taken as seriously as it was. It's worth stepping back to notice how this compares with the version of events circulating on less careful corners of the internet, because not every account of this story holds up under scrutiny. Some commentary has framed Canada's negotiating posture as a kind of bluff from a country desperate for American goodwill, and framed Charrette's warning about walking away as though it had already happened. That characterization is not supported by the named, verifiable reporting from CBC, CTV, Bloomberg, or the Washington Post. What actually happened is narrower and, frankly, more interesting. A warning issued during active negotiations, followed within 72 hours by reporting that the two sides were moving toward, not away from, an agreement. The gap between the dramatic framing and the verified reporting is itself worth remembering the next time a headline about this trade war crosses your feed. There's also the matter of Canada's dairy and softwood lumber disputes, which predate this entire episode and will almost certainly outlast it, regardless of what happens on August 19th. The Congressional Research Service notes that the U.S. Trade Representative has twice challenged Canada's dairy quota system under the existing trade agreement, with mixed results, and that Canada passed legislation in June 2025, explicitly barring its own government from loosening those quotas in future negotiations. A preemptive move that locked in one of Washington's biggest complaints before talks had even reached this stage. Softwood lumber, meanwhile, has been a source of dispute between the two countries for decades, with the last formal agreement governing the trade expiring back in 2015, according to that same congressional research. These are not new grievances manufactured by this year's headlines. They are old wounds this trade war reopened, layered on top of new ones. And there's the broader 2026 review of the USMCA agreement itself sitting underneath all of it, largely unresolved. Congress.gov's own tracking describes 2026 as the year the United States, Canada, and Mexico were scheduled to conduct the first formal joint review of that agreement in its history, a process that could result in the deal being revised, narrowed, or phased out altogether. CBC reported that the Trump administration has already declined to extend the agreement past 2036, adding a layer of long-term uncertainty that exists entirely independent of whatever happens with this week's 50% tariff deadline. Even in the best-case scenario, where Washington and Ottawa strike a deal to avoid the August 19th tariffs, this larger structural question about the future of North American trade remains open. Two older disputes sitting underneath this review deserve a mention too, because Washington has repeatedly cited both as unfinished business. The Congressional Research Service notes the U, Hess Trade Representative has challenged Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system twice under the existing agreement, with mixed outcomes each time, and that Canada's Parliament responded in June 2025 by passing legislation that permanently blocks its own government from raising those quotas or lowering over-quota tariffs in any future negotiation, effectively taking the issue off the table before Washington could negotiate it away. Softwood Lumber tells a similar story on a much longer timeline. The two countries haven't had a governing agreement on that trade since the last one expired back in October 2015, according to the same congressional research, meaning American anti-dumping and countervailing duties have applied to Canadian lumber imports for the better part of a decade already, completely separate from anything Trump has done since returning to office. Both disputes are reminders that even a signed deal this week wouldn't erase everything standing between these two countries. It would just clear the most urgent item off a much longer list. So where does that leave the actual question in the title? Trump's biggest trade mistake, if there is one single moment that deserves the label, is probably not any individual tariff order. It's the decision, back in October 2025, to terminate all trade talks over a political advertisement, even after the Canadian government pulled the ad and its Prime Minister personally apologized. That moment cost both sides months of negotiating time they are now scrambling to make up against a hard deadline. And it happened at the exact moment Canada was actively building alternative trade relationships with China, specifically because reliance on the United States had started to look less certain. Whether that ends up being remembered as a mistake depends entirely on what happens in the next few days, whether the deal the Washington Post describes as within reach actually gets signed, or whether the 50% tariffs take effect as scheduled and Canada's negotiators finally do what they have only warned about so far. Before wrapping up, here's exactly where every claim in this script came from, and where the genuine uncertainty still sits. The tariff timeline, i.e. pot tariffs, and the Supreme Court ruling striking them down are documented by the Congressional Research Service and cross-referenced with Avalara's and Blake's independent tariff timelines. The Windsor unemployment and job loss figures come from Reuters, CBC News, the C.D. Howe Institute, Export Development Canada, and Ontario's Financial Accountability Office. The Reagan advertisement episode and Trump's termination of talks are confirmed by ABC News, NBC News, CBC News, CNN, and Al Jazeera, all of whom reported Trump's own Truth Social statement directly. Carney's Beijing trip and the China trade agreement are confirmed by Canada's own Prime Minister's office and Global Affairs Canada, with Trump's 100% tariff threat confirmed by Reuters and Gulf News. This week's developments, the August 12th CBC and CTV reporting on Canada's rejected offer and Charette's warning, Carney's August 6th comment to the Washington Post calling talks nasty, and today's Washington Post reporting that a deal may be close, represent the most current, verified information available as of this recording. What remains genuinely unresolved, and should be treated as such, is whether a deal gets signed before the August 19th deadline, and what exact concessions either side is prepared to make to get there. Anyone telling you with total certainty how this ends this week is guessing, not reporting. So here's the honest question to leave you with, because this is genuinely unresolved and your answer matters as much as anyone's. Was Ontario's Reagan advertisement worth the 18 months of fallout that followed it? Or was Trump always going to find a reason to freeze these talks eventually, and the ad just happened to be the trigger? And separately, does Canada's pivot toward China represent smart diversification in an uncertain world, or a risk that puts its most important trading relationship in even more jeopardy? Leave your take in the comments, because on this one, the experts themselves don't fully agree. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment this deadline actually resolves, one way or the other.